Start of the Bible. You want to turn to the start of the Bible, to Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve, they're there in the Garden of Eden. Adam rebels against God. And God tells him, do not eat from any tree in the garden. Or, he says, you may eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree that's in the middle of the garden. You must not eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam thinks he knows more than God. He snatches the wisdom and authority from God. And in Genesis 3, verse 22, turn there, Genesis 3:22, God pronounces a judgment. The Lord God has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not now reach out and eat from the tree of life and eat and live forever. And the Lord God sent him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. When Adam rebels against God, the judgment of God is death, that man will no longer live forever. Now, of course, Adam doesn't die immediately. It's not like he eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and is struck down dead. But Philip Jensen's described it like this. He says it's like a flower has been cut. And of course you can put the flower in water and the flower will continue to live, the flower will continue to look good. It doesn't die immediately, but the consequence of cutting the flower is death. And that's really our life. The consequence of Adam's sin, the consequence of our sin, is that we live like cut flowers. We sin, we die. Now, I just want to show you the parallel between that in Genesis 3 and what happens with Saul. Come with me to 1 Samuel 13. We've looked at this chapter the last couple of weeks. We're still doing orientation for our chapter today. But 1 Samuel 13, and it's the same kind of thing that happened. I mean, Saul, the king, didn't wait for the prophet of God, Samuel, to arrive. He was told to wait. He didn't do what he was told to do. He took matters into his own hands. He snatched the wisdom, and he gave all sorts of reasons, all sorts of justifications, but in the end, the judgment of God. At 1 Samuel 13:13, Samuel said to Saul, "You have been foolish. You've not kept the command which the Lord your God gave you. It was at this time the Lord would have permanently established your reign over Israel, but now your reign will not endure." Saul's disobedience, it's like Adam's failure to trust. It's like Adam's disobedience. And Saul, from this point, he's like a cut flower. He's still alive. He could even look good. But it's all over. And we read that. We struggle with it. I felt this in the question time a couple of weeks ago. I feel it in my heart, struggling with that. Because I so identify with Saul. I keep wanting to put aside the command of God and thinking that I know better than God. And I keep identifying with Adam and wanting to put aside the command of God and thinking I know better than God. And in these chapters, 1 Samuel chapter 13, 1 Samuel 14, you see the contrast between Saul, who in his heart says there's no God, who lives going his own way, and his son Jonathan, who trusts God. So we start chapter 14, and actually when we started 14 last week, I don't know if you noticed this, and it didn't particularly jump out to me last week, but as I've thought about it this week, just notice chapter 14 verse 1, the first three words, that same day. And it's worth noting that all the action of chapter 14 happens on one day. See, look at verse 23. So the Lord saved Israel that day. So everything that we saw happen last week, that Jonathan, his armor bearer, crossing down that ravine, coming up, slaying the 20, fighting, breaking out, pandemonium in the Philistine camp, all happened in one day. And actually the verse we start with this week, 1 Samuel 14:23, the battle extended beyond Bethaven and the men of Israel were worn out that day. What we're going to describe in the next few minutes, the worn out, exhausted men of Israel involved in the fight, that's all that day too. Saul was spent that day under the pomegranate tree. Jonathan clearly trusted that day in God. Jonathan that day launched the assault against the Philistines. And there's all sorts of signs as you read it that Saul's flower's been cut, that the judgment of God has come to him. And Saul's under his pomegranate tree. Look at verse 15. Terror spread through the Philistine camp, the open fields to all the troops. Even the garrison and the raiding parties were terrified. The earth shook, terror spread from God. Saul gets the word of what's happening. When Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, they saw the panicking troops scattering in every direction. Rather than immediately jumping to the conclusion that God is doing something to rescue Israel from the Philistines, rather than jumping on board and dispatching the army, verse 17, Saul said to the troops with him, "Call the roll and determine who's..." What a strategically useless move. Saul should have, "We got to get fighting, take advantage." Instead, he's probably worried about who's leading the battle and who's going to get the credit. Saul told Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." Again, another strategically useless move. My guess is he's trying to look spiritual, but actually there's nothing. There is a time for prayer, there is a time for seeking the wisdom of God, but there's a time to get your sword out and fight. And Saul didn't know what time it was. Saul spoke to the priest, verse 19. The panic in the Philistine camp increased in intensity. Saul said to the priest, "Stop what you're doing, put that away." All the assembled troops with him marched to battle. Saul was the leader, but it takes him a long time to start leading, and he eventually follows Jonathan effectively into battle. There the Philistines were fighting 20 against each other in great confusion. These other Hebrews come out. I guess they only come out when the victory's assured. And then verse 23, the Lord saved Israel that day. It was the Lord's victory. The Lord saved Israel. He used Jonathan to achieve it, and Saul was kind of present to direct the mop-up. But if we back up a bit, Saul's direction of the mop-up was profoundly flawed. In fact, I think we'd say he was foolish. I'm not meaning foolish in the stupid sense. I'm meaning foolish in the morally choosing to defy the will of God sense. Look what Saul said to his troops, 23. The battle extended beyond Bethaven. The men of Israel were worn out that day, for Saul had placed the troops under an oath. The man who eats food before evening, before I've taken vengeance on my enemies, is cursed. Now, I said Saul was foolish in the sense of morally defying the will of God, but I also think he was foolish in the conventional sense of being an idiot. It was either Frederick the Great or Napoleon, I couldn't work it out, but one of those two who said, "The army marches on its stomach." You say Napoleon. Well, some say Frederick the Great, some say Napoleon, but then some say pomegranates. Fight. If somebody says, "Fight, but don't eat," that's not going to work. You've got to have food to fight. And look, this is why Saul's command wasn't just stupid, nonsensical. This is why Saul's command was foolish, morally ignoring God. Listen what he says. The man who eats food before evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies, is cursed. Saul is obsessed with avenging himself on his enemies and coercing his people into supporting him. It's all about me. I was reading this week in Luke 12. And in Luke 12, Jesus tells a parable. A rich man's land was very productive. He thought to himself, "What should I do? I don't have anywhere to store my crops. I will do this." He said, "I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up there for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life is demanded of you and the things you've prepared." He was a fool for thinking it was all about him. Saul was a fool for thinking it was all about him. Even doing something allegedly spiritual like the fast, it's about him not God. And the situation for Saul's army, because of his foolish oath, is none of the troops tasted any food. And when the moral energy of the army and the physical energy of the army needed to be at its strongest, the army, due to the foolishness of the king, is at its weakest and most disadvantaged. Now, there's nothing wrong with fasting. This wasn't that day to fast, and if anyone was to fast, well, it should have been Saul, not the army. Now, God provides for his people. There's honey on the ground, honey everywhere. They're tired, they're hungry, they need the energy. 25, everyone goes into the forest, there's honey on the ground. When the troops entered the forest, they saw the flow of honey. None of them ate of it because they feared the oath. However, 27, Jonathan had not heard his father make the troops swear the oath. He reached out with the end of the staff he's carrying, he dipped it in the honeycomb. He didn't stop. He just walking along, dipped it in, he ate the honey, he had renewed energy. One of the troops said, "Your father made his troops solemnly swear, the man who eats food today is cursed." The troops are exhausted. Jonathan replied, "My father has brought trouble to the land." Saul has troubled the land through his foolish oath, through his going his own way, through him being a fool, not a king after God's own heart. And because of him, the people are weak and distracted when they should have been strong. Listen to Jonathan, look at how I have renewed energy because I tasted a little honey. How much better if the troops had eaten freely today from the plunder they took from their enemies. Then the slaughter of the Philistines would have been much greater. Saul has not just, at this point, been deserted by God. We saw him deserted by God 2 weeks ago when Samuel said it's over from God. Now it's over from his son. Saul has lost the confidence of his son Jonathan. And the foolishness of Saul has consequences. 31, the Israelites struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash all the way to Aijalon. But since the Israelites were completely exhausted, they rushed to the plunder, took sheep, cattle and calves, slaughtered them on the ground and ate meat with the blood still in it. Now, we're presuming at this point that with the Philistines fleeing, with evening coming, the day drawing to close, the fast no longer applies. Now, therefore you can eat, but you shouldn't be eating food with the blood still in it. Now, that may not be front of mind for most of us, but if you're an Old Testament Jew, that really should have been a front of mind issue. Because way back earlier in the Old Testament, way back in Leviticus, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, so third book of the Bible, Leviticus 17, the line there was, anyone from the house of Israel, Leviticus 17:10, or from the foreigners who live among them who eats any blood, I'll turn against that person who eats blood and cut him off from his own people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I've appointed it to you to make atonement on the altar for your lives. So there was a food law for the Jewish people that if you're going to eat meat, you don't eat it rare. And they're in such a hurry, they're so hungry, they don't cook it, they just eat it. And they've defied God. But they were kind of put into that desperate position by the foolishness of Saul. Saul doesn't take any of the responsibility. He is hypocritically indignant. Look at this, 33. Some reported to Saul, "Look, the troops are sinning against the Lord by eating the meat with the blood still in it." Saul said, "You have been unfaithful." This is the man who didn't obey God in chapter 13. This is the man who expressed no confidence in God when confronted by his enemies. This is the man who devised the crazy plan to save himself by starving his troops. This is the man who now sounds so concerned at disobedience to Leviticus. He tries to put it right by playing the priest, but actually there's not the slightest hint of him owning any responsibility for the problem. 33, roll a large stone over here at once, go among the troops, say to them, each man bring me an ox or a sheep, do the slaughtering here, then you can eat. Don't sin against the Lord by eating meat with the blood in it. He tries to build an altar, although the author notes that Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he built an altar. It was kind of too little, too late. Saul says, I want to keep following these Philistines. Let's go down after the Philistines tonight, plunder them till morning. Don't let one remain. Again, his whole tone, it's not about what would God have us to do. I want to go down and do the Philistines tonight. It's not about consulting God. It's not about recognizing God is the king over him. It is so different to Jonathan's comment of last week. Perhaps the Lord might give us this. There's none of the Jonathan's line of the Lord will save, whether by many or by few. And he says, we're going to do it. And the troops' response, it's kind of like my kids when they go, whatever. Look at it. Look at the line. Do whatever you want. Whatever, the troops replied. I'm just thinking here, the priest, as he jumps in, and I'm presuming it's the nephew of Glory Depart, Ichabod, that we met last week, who reminds him that God is God. The priest said, we must consult God here. Saul inquired of God, shall I go after the Philistines? Will you hand them over to Israel? God didn't answer him. At that point, you've got to say, we've seen God through his prophet Samuel pronounce the judgment of God. We've seen the people slip away. Remember, he had so many troops and it ended up with just 600. We've seen his son Jonathan distance himself, and now God turns a deaf ear to his request. In response, Saul blunders again. Another his capacity to blunder seems to grow, and he's ignored the prophet's directive. We saw him do the no food while you fight, and now he does the 38. All you leaders of the troops, come here. Let us investigate how this sin has occurred today. As surely as the Lord lives who saves Israel, even if it's because of my son Jonathan, he must die. And the response? Not one of his troops answered him. The king has an army. No one speaks to him. They say nothing. The king has been abandoned by God, abandoned by his son, now abandoned by his people. Not one member of the army is loyal to the pomegranate-sitting king. It's absolutely clear they know where their loyalties lie, and it's not with this morally foolish king. Rather, it's with God and his faithful son, Jonathan. So, verse 40, he said to all Israel, you'll be on one side, I and my son Jonathan will be on the other. And the troops replied, whatever. Do whatever you want. So 41, Saul said to the Lord, God of Israel, give us the right decision. Jonathan and Saul were selected. The troops were cleared. Saul said, cast the lot between me and my son Jonathan. Jonathan was selected. Saul commanded him, tell me what you did. As we read these next few verses, do a compare and contrast with what happened in chapter 13. Because there's two incidents and they're similar, actually. In both cases, the command doesn't make too much sense. Why did Saul have to wait 7 days? Why did God, through the prophet, tell him to wait 7 days? Why did Saul say, don't eat all day? Both cases, the command is broken. Saul does the sacrifice before Samuel gets there. Jonathan eats the honey. Both cases, the transgressors asked, what have you done? But there are critical differences. See, Saul defied a command of God. Jonathan defied the command of a maverick, foolish king who spent his days sitting under pomegranate trees. A command driven by personal pride and foolishness. Saul knew the command he was defying. Jonathan acted in ignorance. Saul did not confess his sin. Jonathan immediately fully confesses. And yet in his statement shows how ridiculously overblown the incident is. Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the end of the staff I was carrying, a spoonful of sugar. I didn't even stop to eat. I dipped my staff while rushing to the battle, but guilty me, hanging a fence. Jonathan is prepared to wear the punishment. I'm ready to die. But Saul's not joking. 44, Saul declared to him, may God punish me and do so severely if you do not die, Jonathan. I think he's actually becoming unhinged. Suddenly a spoonful of sugar is a hanging offence, and you got this guy, he doesn't obey God in chapter 13. He expressed no confidence in God when facing the enemies. He marks the role instead of fighting. He comes up with a crazy plan to save himself by starving his troops. He's hypocritically indignant about the people's sin. But now he's prepared to kill his courageous and godly son. Jonathan is the leader that Saul should have been. Jonathan does trust God. Jonathan has consistently expressed his dependence on God. I was reading one guy from Andrews Uni who pointed out Jonathan is accused of transgressing the law of God. Jonathan is accused of transgressing human command, but never transgresses the law of God. And at that point, actually, there's a little allusion to Jesus, in that Jesus is accused of transgressing human command. He never transgressed the law of God. Jonathan confesses that he's willing to lay down his life, yet he is rescued. He actually illustrates to his father how his father should have reacted in chapter 13, how differently things might have turned out if he had. Jonathan's preparedness to die for a silly human accusation actually does point beyond himself to Jesus. And when you think that, you think, yeah, Jesus dies. So you and I, who like Saul actually did transgress a divine law, could be forgiven. Anyway, the next sentence marks really, I think, the end of the reign of Saul. But the people said to Saul, must Jonathan die, 45, who accomplished such a great deliverance for Israel? Now as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he worked with God's help today. So the people redeemed Jonathan, and he did not die. At that point, it's really over as a leader for Saul. I read these verses and I think of David Cameron. And if you're following the whole Brexit decision, he put his heart, his everything into the Remain campaign. And when the people of Great Britain rejected that policy that he put everything into, he said, really, in his speech, they're not just rejecting the decision, they're rejecting me. Britain needs new leadership. And really what's happened is the people, on a fundamental issue, reject Saul. And it would be great, actually. I don't know what you thought. I thought David Cameron's speech was admirable. I've lost my mandate. I need to resign. It'd be great if Saul gave that kind of speech. The country needs new leadership. But he doesn't. What's the takeaway message for us? Well, first, actually, Saul wasn't a complete failure. He did have some success. 47, Saul assumed the leadership of Israel. He fought against his enemies in every direction, against Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zoab, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he caused havoc. He fought bravely, defeated the Amalekites, delivered Israel from the hand of those who plundered them. If Saul was a failure as a king, and he was, It wasn't because of lack of military skill. He did deliver Israel from its foes. But his failure was that Saul never did what he was commissioned by God to do. If you flick back 3 chapters to 1 Samuel 9, you'll be reminded of what Saul was commissioned to do. 1 Samuel 9:16, "At this time tomorrow I'll send you a man from the land of Benjamin, anoint him ruler over my people Israel. He will save them from the hand of the Philistines." He was commissioned to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines, and yet chapter 14:52, the conflict with the Philistines was there all Saul's days. He was always fighting with the Philistines. He never defeated the Philistines. You keep reading that verse, and whenever Saul noticed any strong or brave man, he enlisted him. And Samuel said, actually, you put this king, he'll just take all your sons. 1 Samuel 8:11. And so he won't be any good for you. And I think the real lesson from Saul for us, as John Woodhouse points out, Saul is one of the great tragic figures of world history, the great tragic figures of literature. And when we read his story, as we have these last few weeks, we see our own weaknesses as well. Saul fails as I fail. Saul fails as you fail. I know what it is to forget God. I know what it is to not really trust him. I know what it is to disobey him. I feel so uneasy when I see God judge Saul for his Adam-like failure, because I can so easily see myself doing that same thing. And so in my bones, I want to defend him. But the lack of faith in God that Saul has is foolish. And yet I keep coming up with little foolish, silly schemes to save myself. Just like Saul's little foolish, silly scheme, his dumb oath to save himself. It's only God who can save. It's only God who is solid. It's only God who is reliable. And so the message from looking at these chapters of the Bible is do not be like Saul. Do not forget God. Do trust God. Do obey God. What about a lesson from Jonathan? And in this, I'm just going to give you really word for word Jonathan Bauer's notes from his classroom discussion at Bethlehem College. He compares, and actually this is lovely, at the beginning we started comparing Saul and Adam. I want us to compare Adam and Jonathan. Jonathan was under an obligation not to eat any food till evening. Adam and Eve were under the command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They both did what they shouldn't. Jonathan tasted honey. Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and gave some to her husband. The consequence of breaking the oath, breaking the command, in both cases was death. Neither Jonathan nor our first parents, Adam and Eve, took the initiative in revealing their transgression. And for both Jonathan and Adam and Eve, the promised death, or promised immediate death, was averted through a ransom. The text in 1 Samuel doesn't say what kind of ransom the people provided, but 1 Samuel 14:45, there was a ransom. And for Adam and Eve, ultimately, the ransom is through the seed of the woman crushing the serpent's head. Through Jesus defeating the devil. There are similarities between Jonathan and his sin and Adam and Eve's sin. But there are differences. Jonathan Bowers points out, and this is actually marvellous. Saul's command to Jonathan was foolish and self-serving. God's command to Adam and Eve was wise and loving. Jonathan transgressed out of ignorance. Adam and Eve sinned knowingly. Even though Jonathan broke Saul's oath unknowingly, he was still willing to accept the consequence of death. Adam and Eve sinned with a high hand and wanted nothing to do with the consequences. In fact, they tried to weasel out of their guilt by shifting the blame. The woman you put here with me, she did it. The serpent, he taught me. They try to shift the blame. The Israelites ransomed Jonathan really out of his respect for the way that he's led them, the way that he's... In their eyes, Jonathan had worked a great salvation in Israel. Adam and Eve were turncoats and cowards. In Jonathan's case, the people provide a ransom to satisfy Saul's demands. In our case, God, the offended party, takes it upon himself to provide a ransom. And the ransom he provides is no light thing. It is the blood of his very own Son, Jesus. When we think about Jonathan's deliverance and our own deliverance, it makes my mind go to Romans 5. Very rarely will someone die for a just person, though for a good person, perhaps, someone might even dare to die. But God proves his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us.